The late 1800s into the early 1900s is known in history as the Gilded Age. And gilded is it's a process where you put a very thin layer of gold on another metal object. And so it makes it look like it's very valuable. It makes it look like it has a ton of gold, but it actually is not that valuable because they just put this tiny, tiny thin layer of gold over it all. And so the idea of the Gilded Age is that it looked really good if you looked at the surface because you saw the rich people doing really well, like the robber barons or captains of industry, however you see it. But there was a lot of issues that were kind of hidden underneath the rest of it. So even though it looks really good, there was some nasty stuff going on. And some of those problems that were seen in the city are outlined right here. Okay. And the first one is poverty. There were a lot of people struggling that did not have enough money to pay for health care or anything like that. Okay. They also was a problem of the spread of slums. And slums are places that people live that have very, very bad living conditions. And so it's very hard to live in those areas. And some of them, didn't have running water, or many people would be expected to live in small space. It was just not a good situation for people living. The third one is poor working conditions. People were doing dangerous jobs and they were working too much. There were also corrupt politics. It was called the spoils system, where people would just give their friends or anybody who helped them out, they would give them jobs and things like that. Okay, so you could do a lot of bribery and things of that nature. And the last thing was the corporations. The big businesses were starting to gain a lot of power in the government. They were becoming way too powerful to where businesses could be the driving force behind law changes, which a lot of people are arguing we still have that problem to this day. And so all this corruption and negativity brought out a new type of kind of reporter, I guess, and they were called muckrakers, right? And we're going to talk a lot about muckrakers, but muckrakers are writers who exposed corruption in American society, okay? And so what their goal was they wanted to show the worst stuff, the absolute worst stuff that was happening, to make people move to actually act, and so that they would actually try and fix some of the problems, because if you didn't show how bad it really was in some places, then people wouldn't really care. People don't get bothered by somebody who just doesn't have enough money to get by day by day. They get bothered by when people are starving to death and sleeping on the streets and things like that. So they really wanted to show the worst. And so Ida Tarbell, this woman right over here on the left, she wrote about Standard Oil, okay, and she wrote about how they were hurting consumers, they were hurting the people buying, and small businesses by taking out all of the other businesses so that they could make the prices whatever they wanted, okay, because everybody needed the gasoline and oil that they were providing. Upton Sinclair also wrote a book called The Jungle about meat and how basically how butchers and meat plants were kind of being run in a really disgusting way. And so because of the muckrakers and just because of generally seeing the problems, there was a response to them. And the response is known as progressivism. And progressivism is a reform movement put together by normal people, by politicians, by all kinds of different areas to address these problems, to try to make changes, to try and fix them. And so there were three major goals of progressivism. For some reason, one of them went away, but I'll write it on there. Okay, the first one is to reform government and expand democracy. And so trying to make the government more democratic, to try and help out the people so that everybody had a vote and it wasn't just about the rich people and just about the corporations. They also were trying to promote social welfare. And then the last one is to create economic reform. So I don't know why it disappeared off the slide, but now it is there. As long as you're listening, you'll know where that goes. Okay, so that's the third goal of progressivism, and each one of them will have their own slides. We'll talk about them more. So some of the major changes that were made to the government to try and expand democracy and make sure people were taken care of and we didn't have all of this corruption. The first one was patronage, and patronage tried to address and get rid of the spoils system where you would just give your friends a job in government if you became the president or anybody powerful in government. And so basically the problem with the spoils system and patronage was that people were trading jobs and contracts for votes. So they'd say, oh, I can get my whole company, everybody to vote for you if you can let us build this bridge or whatever, even though we're more expensive than the other people. Or, if I could get a job as a postman, I would definitely want to vote for you. And so kind of like bribery for votes or paying someone for votes. And so what happened to try and stop patronage was the Pendleton Civil Service Act. And the Pendleton Civil Service Act set up a civil service examination, so you have to actually take a test to do any government jobs. And what you have to do is you have to take a test to prove that you're actually qualified for the job that you're trying to get. Okay, and so it also made a rule that not only do you have to take a test, but you can't just fire these people that have taken the test and gotten the jobs for political reasons. If you come in as a Democrat and a bunch of Republicans were hired before, you can't just fire them just because they're Republicans, or can't just fire them just because you want to fill that spot with your job. You have to have a real reason to fire somebody from a civil service job. The second thing that changed with the reforming the government and expanding democracy was a direct primary was created. And a direct primary, what ends up happening is the voters get to choose who gets to run for political office. And so at the beginning of every cycle, there is a bunch of Democrats that want to be the president and a bunch of Republicans that want to be the president. And so each party has their own small election and they vote. So there might be 10 Republicans that all the Republicans vote for, and they get to decide, every state gets a vote, and they get to decide who the candidate should be that's actually going to go for president. And the same thing happens with the Democrats. And so that's what a direct primary is. And so it allows the people to not only pick from these two random people who are selected by, corporations and fancy people. Instead, they actually get to pick who their best person is from the pool of maybe 20 people instead of just from 2 people. And then the last thing that was created in reforming the government and expanding democracy are these 3 things. The first one is initiative. Initiative was created, which means that voters can propose a law directly. And what you have to do is you have to write a petition up and you have to get a certain number of signatures, and then you can bring a law up in front of Congress and they have to vote on it. Okay. Referendum is another one, and a referendum says that if Congress doesn't want to make that decision, or if they think the people should make the decision, you can take a proposed law and you can submit it to a vote of the people. So every single person votes in a ballot to decide if that law should go through or not. Okay, and then recall is the last one. And recall, what that does, it allows you to vote an official out of office. So it's easier to eliminate corruption if these people can be voted out by just regular citizens, because they have to prove that they're worthy to every single person, instead of just make sure that the people in charge, maybe the people in Congress or whatever, are happy with them and that they won't vote them out. The normal people can vote somebody out of office. That's recall. The next big category was promoting social welfare, which just means trying to help people out. And so the reason that the way we were trying to help people out was to fight poverty, try and make sure people had jobs and money, to fight unemployment, and to fight poor working conditions. Okay, and a lot of this was done through the creation of unions and work that was done within unions. Now, Jane Addams, however, did a lot for women. She set up this place, this campus almost, okay, and it is called Hull House 651. She set it up in Chicago, and she took donations from wealthy Chicagoans and paid for it. And what it was this campus where women that were struggling, maybe had kids and were single, or were trying to get their career started or something like that, and were really, really struggling, they would actually watch the kids while the women went out and got educated or went to their careers or whatever, and they would give free kind of daycare. And also they would put programs together to train the women to have these jobs. And so Jane Addams put together this house to help out women to try and make their lives better off. Florence Kelley was another woman who was an advocate for both women and the regular people, every single person. Okay, and her biggest concern was child labor, but she also talked about minimum wage laws and making sure that people should be getting paid a certain amount of money, otherwise it wasn't fair, so there should be a minimum wage. And then she also said that hours should be limited not just for working men, but also limited for working women too. You should only have to work X amount of hours. Right now it's 40 hours that you should only have to work that, otherwise you should get paid extra for overtime. Another group that was working towards promoting social welfare kind of popped up again, like it was an old group that we had talked about, and it was prohibitionists. So kind of like the temperance movement, but a little bit different. Prohibitionists wanted to completely get rid of alcohol. They wanted to prevent alcohol from ruining people's lives because a lot of the same problems were coming up, and so they wanted to make alcohol completely illegal. That's what prohibitionists wanted, and that movement started to get really big at this time. Okay, and last of these big categories is creating economic reform, changing how the economy worked. And the big way they wanted to change how the economy worked was to limit the power of big businesses. Basically, they wanted to take away their ability to make monopolies. They wanted to take away their ability to limit or destroy competition. Okay, they didn't want there to be one company who did oil and one company who did steel, and et cetera, et cetera. And so the Sherman Antitrust Act was created by Congress, and it made it illegal to gain control of industries. It made it illegal to have a monopoly. The problem was it really wasn't used to do that. Mostly, it only got used to limit labor unions and take away their power, which is completely the opposite of what it was trying to accomplish. And so companies like Standard Oil and steel companies and things like that, and railroads that had monopolies were left alone because they had so much power within the government. And so in order to enforce it, you had to have a strong leader who was willing to stand up to these corporations. And at that point, they didn't have a strong leader, so it was kind of a worthless act as it began. And that strong leader that would come in and kind of knock down these corporations and really work for the people was Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, also known as TR or Teddy Roosevelt. You'll hear people say those couple of things about him. He's not the only president that will have the last name Roosevelt. Another one will come later, and that's why we talk about his first name every time we say it instead of just his last name. But he was really the first progressive president. And the way that he became president was he was elected not as president, but as vice president. And he was vice president for McKinley. And McKinley, later on, about 6 months after he was elected, was standing at the World's Fair and waiting shaking hands and signing autographs and talking to people, and there was a line of people, and there was a man in that line, an unemployed anarchist. So an anarchist is a person who thinks that there should be no government at all, okay? And he was in the line, and he stepped up to him, and McKinley gave him his hand to shake his hand, and the anarchist fired 2 shots into McKinley's body, and McKinley later died. Okay, and that, of course, made the vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, the president, and he was the youngest president in United States history at the age of 42 years old. He was in the Navy. He had fought in many wars. He had done a lot of different things that we'll actually talk about in the next unit, because we'll talk about his younger life. We'll have to get in a time machine and go backwards, but that's the way we're going to work it. But what he believed in was the square deal. And he said, the government is here to make sure that everything's fair. Okay, we need a square deal for everybody. So it's fair for workers, it's fair for consumers, it's fair for big business, not just the people that, nobody should have an advantage over anybody else. It should just be fair for everybody. And that's why the government's around, to make sure that happens. Otherwise, the big rich companies are going to bully the little guy all the time. And so he started to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act. He was that powerful leader, and he started to bust up trusts. So he started to bust up these monopolies and eliminate them. Any bad trusts, any bad monopolies, he got rid of, and he kept the good ones. So he got rid of railroads, and he broke up the Standard Oil Trust, and he broke up the Tobacco Trust, and he had all of these lawsuits that he was winning using the Sherman Antitrust Act against these people. And so you can see we've got the railroad trust down here in this picture, and Theodore Roosevelt is twisting its arm and taking care of it. So that's a political cartoon about what he was able to do to those companies. All right, so let's talk about some more things that Roosevelt did, some more of his progressive policies. Upton Sinclair, the man we talked about before, wrote a book called The Jungle, and The Jungle was about the horrible conditions and disgusting parts of meatpacking plants. And so because of this book, that Roosevelt had read, he put together two different I guess groups of people. Okay, he put together the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act to protect people from kind of nasty stuff happening with their food and their medicine. He also really, really loved nature, Theodore Roosevelt did. And so in 1903, he was out with his friend John Muir, and he was camping in the Yosemite Valley. And there's a picture right here of the Yosemite Valley, just a beautiful part of America. Okay, and he was out there, and his friend John Muir was talking to him about how it's so important to keep these things around and not let people come out and ruin them. And so he ended up starting with John Muir. And because of him, Theodore Roosevelt ended up starting the national parks movement. And then eventually people said, oh, that's enough land. You can't take up that much land with the national parks and stuff like that. And so he started to use workarounds and use something called the Antiquities Act to create national monuments instead of national parks, which would do the same thing. It wouldn't allow people to go out there and mess with them. But it's kind of a tricky way around. And so the Grand Canyon is protected under the Antiquities Act. And also the petrified forests in California. There's a lot of different ones that are protected with this Antiquities Act. Okay, and so just kind of an interesting way that he saved nature. And even when people stopped him through the national parks, he said, well, I'll figure out another way to save these important parts of America and the important parts that nature has provided, not that man has created. William Howard Taft became the next president after Theodore Roosevelt, and he was kind of, in 1908, Theodore Roosevelt didn't want to run again. He was done being president. He didn't want to do it anymore. And so he picked William Howard Taft because what he thought Taft is going to continue working on our progressive goals. He's going to be a very progressive government and continue to work. And everybody loved Roosevelt, so when he said, William Howard Taft's your man, William Howard Taft won very easily. Okay, and so he was the next president of the United States. And so the 16th Amendment came under William Howard Taft, and the 16th Amendment created a graduated income tax. And a graduated income tax was a way of taking away that tax on land and stuff like that kind of penalized you for being a farmer. Okay, and excuse me, and making it based on how much money you make. And because it was a graduated income tax, that meant that the richer people actually had to pay more and the poorer people had to pay less. And so it's the same graduated income tax idea that we still use today, where everybody pays a percentage of their income. Rich people pay a higher percentage of their income and poor people pay a lower percentage of their income. The other thing that came under William Howard Taft was the 17th Amendment, and the 17th Amendment called for the direct election of U.S. senators. Before this point, the state legislator was picking the state legislature, so they would vote and they would pick who the senators were going to be. And now with the direct election of U.S. senators, where the people vote for them, you couldn't corrupt it as easily, because it was easier to corrupt the state legislature than it was to corrupt the entire state. Okay, and eventually, at the end especially of his run as president, William Howard Taft became a little bit more conservative. He started to back off from his progressive goals, and Theodore Roosevelt didn't like that. He wanted to keep progressive and just keep pushing as hard as he could to help the people of America. And so Roosevelt decided, you know what, if he's not going to do it right, he's not going to do it the way that I want him to, then I'm going to run against him. And so Roosevelt created a third party, a progressive party called the Bull Moose Party in 1912. And he ran against William Howard Taft. Okay, and so when Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft split up, that half of the people that are going to vote for their party, the other party ends up winning. So the half that are going to vote Republican, if they get split between Roosevelt and Taft, and the other half all vote for Wilson, then all of a sudden Wilson has the most votes. Okay, and so let's say William Howard Taft ended up with 30 votes and Roosevelt ends up with 21 votes, and that leaves Wilson, the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, with 50, well, let's even just say 49, okay, 49 votes, right? Now, Wilson has the most votes. Wilson becomes the president. However, if Roosevelt hadn't stepped in and had let Taft continue to run with nobody else against him, Taft might have gotten that whole 51% and won, okay? And so because Roosevelt had a problem with how Taft was running his presidency, in the end, he kind of ended up taking it away from him. Even though he didn't win the election, he kind of gave it over to the Democrats and Woodrow Wilson, who would be the next president. So now Woodrow Wilson would be the 28th president of the United States. And a lot of people thought since he was a Democrat, he'd be different and he wouldn't continue to go through all these progressive things. And so he thought that, or a lot of people thought that Woodrow Wilson would end progressivism, but he actually was a very progressive president as well. He continued to work to break up those monopolies and help out the workers. He actually put together a new antitrust act that was more powerful than the Sherman Antitrust Act, called the Clayton Antitrust Act. And the Clayton Antitrust Act said, or had a lot of different rules. It said, first, you can't buy the stock of your competitor. So you cannot buy out a competitor, buy them and take control of their company so that you can take control of the entire so you can take control of the entire industry. So if I am a chip salesman, or if I am, let's say, Pop, okay, I am part of Pepsi, I'm the owner of Pepsi, I can't buy stock in Coke and become an owner of Coke so that I can make the prices the same for Pepsi and Coke and run the entire thing. All right, that wouldn't be fair. So you can't buy the stock of someone who you're in competition with. The second thing is, it said that labor unions need to be more powerful, and so labor unions were allowed to merge. They were allowed to come together and expand to get bigger. It also took away the power of the courts to end strikes. They said you can't do that to people. You have no right as a judge to say that these people can't strike and not go to work. Okay, and then it also made it legal to have strikes, and really obviously legal to have strikes, picketing. Picketing is, standing outside of a business with your signs, and boycotts, meaning not wanting to do different things. All right, and another thing that he did was the Federal Reserve Act, and the Federal Reserve Act set up, so the way it worked is it set up these federal banks, and these federal banks would give loans to all the other banks. So they were kind of the banks that the other banks went to when they needed money. And so what the federal banks did, or the Federal Reserve Act did, is it gave power of the money supply to the government. And so since the government's in charge of it, they can keep inflation from happening, and they can make sure that the economy is running in the best possible way. And the last one, again, it got cut off. I don't know what's happening with this slideshow, but it got cut off. And so the last one that Woodrow Wilson did was the 18th Amendment. And the 18th Amendment, I hope you remember, is the prohibition of alcohol. And so prohibition, I guess I could write that up in the top left corner. There's some room for spelling. Prohibition. Okay, so 18th made alcohol illegal, the prohibition of alcohol, and that happened under Woodrow Wilson. Also, during the progressive era, the roles of women started to change. Factories started to make products like canned food and soap and things like that women used to have to make on their own at home. And a bunch of inventions like vacuum cleaners, electric vacuum cleaners, and washing machines and things like that started to make the housework easier, house cleaning easier at home. And so housekeeping became a much easier thing, and you didn't really need a full-time person to do it anymore. So women were able to start working. Families also started to become smaller. People just had less kids, and so the women started to work. A couple of the major things they started to work in were nursing and teaching. And so they were kind of jobs that were left open by men that men were less interested in doing. And so the nursing and the teaching became kind of heavily women careers, and they still are today. A much higher percentage of teachers and nurses are women than are men. The other thing that happened with the women and some roles that they got was college education, and they started to this college education and being able to learn medicine and things like that started to really open up new professions for women so that they could start to get closer to equal with men. And so they really started to become empowered, and they started to think, why shouldn't we continue to push and continue to have more and more power? And so women's suffrage is the thing that they finally pushed for. Okay, and this will be the last thing we talk about in this slideshow, but it's it was called the NAWSA, which you have on your notes there, which is the National American Woman Suffrage Association. So you got to fill in that NAWSA. Okay, and so the president of the NAWSA became Susan B. Anthony, which we've talked about before, who she was. And so with her at the helm, they just continued to fight and fight and fight for suffrage, for the ability to vote. And so it started to come to them, and it started in some states in the West, and then it moved out east, and eventually it came to where NAWSA had about 2 million people that were members in 1917. And in World War I, the women we're going to talk about it when we talk about World War I, but they were really important in winning the war because they were supporting the war effort. They weren't really allowed to go over and fight or anything like that, but they were staying back and keeping the factories going and keeping the farms running and keeping everything going like they often do. And so Woodrow Wilson said women are vital in the winning of the war, and so he also pushed for women's suffrage and women's equality. Okay, and so the 19th Amendment was eventually made, okay, and it was made also in Woodrow Wilson's time, and the 19th Amendment, remember, is women's suffrage. It is the ability for women to vote. And so there was a woman who was there when the first vote happened named Charlotte Woodard, and she's kind of famous because she was there in 1848 at that Seneca Falls Convention, the very first women's right convention in America, and she was there as a young girl. And then in 1920, she was one of the first women to vote. So she was there from the beginning to the end for the entire process of the women's rights movement. Just a person that was involved, Charlotte Woodard.